Russia is suffering very high casualties, and since the invasion at the end of February, they may have lost about a quarter of their initial fighting force. And they're struggling to provide adequately trained replacements. Mark Cancian is a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mark, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Before we talk about Russian troop levels, I want to ask you about the horrific images that we're seeing come out of Bucha. What does that indicate to you about the discipline of the Russian military?
Well, the images, of course, are very disturbing, and the incidents seem to be quite widespread. They're talking about hundreds of bodies. The Ukrainians are investigating, which I think is absolutely necessary. It does seem to indicate some breakdown in discipline. Some of the cases certainly look like war crimes. I think we'll know more once the Ukrainians have a chance to investigate thoroughly. But there have been a lot of issues about Russian troop discipline and morale, discussions or reports about troops refusing to fight, troops killing their officers, sabotaging equipment. So there's, I think, some questions about the state of the Russian military.
Well, put the Russian troop losses in perspective for us. How significant is it? You know, we're looking at numbers like, 10,000, 14,000. I mean, a lot of, it's pretty significant.
Well, the losses are very significant. We have to keep in mind that the Russian army today is not the Red Army of World War II that marched to victory over the bodies of its dead. It's a much smaller military. The total military is about 900,000. And to put that in perspective, the U.S. military is about 1.3 million. It looks like they've taken somewhere between 7,000 and 15,000 killed, figuring that there may be twice as many wounded. That would be about 40,000 casualties. And their initial combat force was probably about 150,000. The whole combat force was maybe 200,000, but a lot of that was militias and support troops. So they have possibly lost a quarter of their forces, and replacing those is going to be very difficult. The Russians don't have a good reserve system, so they, unlike the United States, so plugging those holes is going to be difficult. Also, to put it in perspective, if they've lost 15,000, that was about how many troops they lost in 10 years of combat in Afghanistan. So they may have lost as many troops in 4 weeks as they lost in 10 years in Afghanistan.
And I mean, how large is Russia's armed forces, as far as numbers? And how does that compare to the size of the U.S. armed forces?
Well, it's important, again, to keep in mind that this is not the Russian military of the Cold War or the Soviet military. That military was about 3 million active duty personnel. This military is about 900,000 total, with a small reserve force. They have a lot of people on the books, but it's not a reserve force that trains or is very ready. By comparison, the United States has about 1.3 million on active duty and another 800,000 in pretty high readiness reserve units. So the United States is much larger. And the Russian military looks this way because of reforms that they instituted in 2008. In 2008, they invaded the country of Georgia. They won, but they won ugly. They went through a series of reforms after that. The military got smaller, brought in a lot more volunteers. The training got better. The equipment got better. And they built a military that, at least on the surface, looked a lot more like us.
So there have been intelligence reports that Putin might not be getting the truth about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. But, you can't hide dead soldiers. So how could he not know Russian casualty numbers?
There's been a lot of speculation that Putin is not getting good information about how the war is going, and that's not surprising. In authoritarian regimes, no one wants to bring bad news to the person at the top because of the retaliation that might result. And Putin has clamped down on independent reporting, so it's not that there's an independent press or reports coming in from the outside. And just looking at the visuals, when Putin has a meeting, he's at the end of this long table with everyone on the other end, and that just reinforces the notion that maybe he's not in close contact. On the other hand, he has fired some senior officials, which indicates that some recognition that things aren't going well. They've changed their strategy. So, there must be some notion about the war isn't going terribly well. And to be fair to the Russians, it's very hard in the middle of a war to get good information up to the top. The United States, of course, was criticized for that during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, that what troops are seeing on the ground was not getting to senior military and civilian leaders. On the question about whether they can conceal their casualties, and certainly they've worked to do that. They've underreported their casualties. There are reports that troops are being cremated and not being losses not being announced. But at some point, the scale will get through to the Russian people.
Where's the tipping point here, Mark? I mean, how many Russian soldiers have to be killed before Putin says we need to be serious about a diplomatic solution?
I think the tipping point is going to be with the generals. The Russians, I think, are running against time. Their casualties are high. They're trying to replace those, but the replacements won't have the skill or the cohesion of the original forces. They're drawing down their stocks, unlike the Ukrainians, who are getting constantly resupplied from the West. Morale seems to be difficult. And of course, on the home front, dissent is increasing. I think at some point, the generals are going to get together among themselves and go to Putin and say, if you don't negotiate some sort of ceasefire, the army is going to break. There's a history of that in Russia, and bad things happen to the governing groups when the army breaks.
Lastly, Mark, I mean, what do we know about Russian support for the war in light of these losses?
There's clearly a lot of opposition to the war in the Russian population. Putin has tried to clamp down, but some information gets through. It's not possible to fully stop the flow of information. And I think that over time that opposition is going to increase. When we see what happened in Afghanistan, there were mothers groups, for example, that got together and put information out as mothers tried to find out what had happened to their children. You see that happening now. So I think that opposition is just going to continue to increase.
All right, Mark, thanks very much for talking to us. Nice to have you.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Coming next, the Arctic is at the forefront of China and Russia's economic strategies. But could it divide their alliance? You're watching WJLA 24/7 News. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any future Government Matters interviews.